I'm back. Did you miss me? No. Today we are going to finish the book of Ruth, and I can hear your thoughts. You're getting whiplash from how fast we have made it through the book of Ruth. But some books of the Bible are longer than others, and that's the way it works. And I hope that this book of the Bible has presented you with a number of very valuable lessons that you are applying to your life. And hopefully the conclusion today will be no exception. Like I said, we are going to look at the end of the book of Ruth in chapter 4, so you might want to turn there with me. And what we're going to see today is the plan of God fulfilled. We are going to see that Naomi, good old bitter, never needed to feel the way that she did, because God had it all taken care of in his plan. We're going to see that God was working through all the details to accomplish his plan. We're going to see the amazing provision and knowledge of God. And we're going to see that the fulfillment of God's plan in the lives of Ruth and Boaz and Naomi is just a tiny piece in the full tapestry of God's plan. But before we dive into the text today, I want to see if I can start a little fight. Okay? So, what I need to know is how many of you in the room are planners? You like to think out things. You make plans, how they're going to work out. You make sure there's enough time for everything. All the pieces you need are in order. You even anticipate potential problems and be ready with solutions. How many of you are planners? Okay? Now, I have to ask the opposite side. How many of you are seat of your pants people? No need for a plan. Just go with the flow and it'll work out. How many are that kind of people? I see two hands from some of those people. All right, now let me ask you this. Planners, how do you feel about those non-planners? Do you ever get frustrated with them for their lack of plan? Or worse, for when they mess up your plans? How about this? Not out loud, obviously, but in the back of your mind, are you ever slightly envious of the carefree nature of the non-planner? Now, non-planners, how do you feel about the planners? Do you ever get annoyed with them for not being willing to deviate from the plan? Or, in the back of your mind, do you ever wish that you could have everything thought about ahead of time like the planner? Human beings can be different, can't we? Well, I have to tell you that I lean more toward the planner side of that scale. And last week, I was extremely pleased with my plan. It was a very busy weekend for me, if you didn't know. We had a youth group beach trip and a service project down there on Long Beach Island on Saturday. I had to preach there on Sunday, and the youth weren't staying overnight there. And then we had ministry team meetings here on Sunday afternoon. So I made a plan, and it was a detailed plan. And the van left the parking lot outside here at 7 a.m. on Saturday morning sharp with me at the wheel. And we arrived on Long Beach Island right when I expected. And I took the youth group for a nice walk on the beach, which didn't quite go as far as I wanted because they walk a little slower than I was expecting. We turned around and we had lunch right when we were supposed to, the exact minute. And we arrived at the church on the island right on time to do our service project. The youth worked hard, and the church property there looks great, and they're all really thankful. The church down there is very grateful to Cornerstone for sending our youth there to help them. But we spent some time on the beach. We got cleaned up. We had dinner right at the moment in the plan when we were supposed to have dinner. We visited a certain pastor emeritus at Acme and arrived back here at Cornerstone almost exactly. We were 1 minute behind when I said we'd be back. The plan was going well, so it continued. After the kids all went home, I got back in the car and drove back 3 hours to Long Beach Island. And I stayed there overnight. I got up and preached at their service in the morning. Then I got back in the car and and drove back here, right in time for our ministry team meetings. And we had good meetings, and the day was completed, and the plan went well. The plan came up without a hitch, really. The plan worked. Like I said, I'm a planner, and like Hannibal Smith from the A-Team, I love it when a plan comes together. And last weekend, the plan had come together. I patted myself on my back, and I got in my car to drive home. It was right then that I realized that the plan hadn't worked as well as I thought. Because all of a sudden, an element that had slipped my plan became obvious. Man, was I tired. I'd spent 48 hours moving nonstop, driving probably half of it, except for Saturday night when I was asleep, which was actually Sunday morning because I didn't actually get back to the island until after 1 a.m. So what I found out is that my plan had entirely worked. Almost. Now, when we look at the book of Ruth, we've also seen a couple planners in that book, haven't we? Naomi and Boaz make some plans. And they enact their plans, and then we got to see how their plans worked. And last week, we saw Naomi's plan to wrangle Ruth and Boaz together come to completion. And we saw the plan Boaz came up with to fulfill his duty as kinsman redeemer enacted and completed. Naomi, through what some might call trickery or manipulation, even dangerously, got the man she wanted, Boaz, to be the one who fulfilled the role as kinsman redeemer for her and Ruth. Her plan had worked. Fortunately, no harm had come to Ruth as well. Boaz successfully implemented his plan to have the actual kinsman redeemer abdicate his responsibility, allowing Boaz to fulfill the role. His plan worked. It had protected Ruth's reputation. It even allowed the other guy to save face in getting out of his responsibility. It made Boaz look good in front of everyone. The planner's plans had worked, probably better than mine did. And Ruth 4:13 tells us that Boaz and Ruth married, and together they had a son. So in the conclusion of this story, we see that Ruth and Naomi are now taken care of. They are blessed. The family line is continued. And all the problems that were introduced at the beginning of the book of Ruth seem far, far away. But we need to be honest about this situation. It was not Naomi's plan that fixed those issues. It was not the plan of Boaz that remedied the situation. Both of their plans had flaws and details that weren't considered, like my plan about the beach. The plans of the planners were incomplete, and what we really see is the plan and provision of God. God worked it all out. And this is a fact that the women of Bethlehem point out to Naomi. Remember, the beginning of the book, when she and Ruth came back from Moab, remember where Naomi was in her thinking? Woe is me, God is picking on me. Don't call me pleasant, call me bitter, because God has made my life bitter. Now, here at the fulfillment of the plan of God, we see the women who Naomi was complaining to before come back to Naomi, and they say, "Praise be to Yahweh, who this day has not left you without a kinsman redeemer. May he be famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, is better to you than 7 sons, and she has given birth to him." They say to Naomi, "You were wrong. God wasn't picking on you. God was providing for you all along. He didn't leave you bitter and without a redeemer. He didn't leave you all alone. You had Ruth the whole time, and she was the biggest blessing you could have possibly asked for." Now, Naomi could have potentially been thinking that it was her plan that worked everything out. But what we know is that it is undeniable that God was the one who worked it all out. Naomi's plan was incomplete. Without God, Naomi would have been lost, and the plan would have failed. God gave Naomi Ruth, who wouldn't leave her even when she was urged to, who stayed with Naomi, who worked to provide for both of them, and who ended up providing Naomi with a grandson. As the women point out, Ruth was more valuable to Naomi than either of her two sons that she lost, plus some more. God knew what he was doing. But even more than that, God arranged it so that the famine ended at the right time. He arranged it so that Boaz took notice of Ruth. He arranged it so that Boaz, it was all part of God's plan, that Boaz was a kind and honorable man. Boaz was unmarried and was in the position to fulfill his role as kinsman redeemer. God's plan was successful here. And the women of Bethlehem make sure Naomi knows about it. Naomi thought she was empty because of the hand of God. But it turns out that she ended up being even more blessed and full because of the plan of God. She thought she was being emptied out, but God was emptying her out to fill her even more. It says that she became the nurse of the child, and everyone recognized how blessed Naomi was because of what God had done. Naomi's view was small at the beginning of the story. But there's more than that. At the end of Ruth, it presents us with the continuation of the story that continues after the book of Ruth. It says that Ruth's child, Naomi's grandson, through the plan and provision of God, was named Obed, and Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. Did you hear that? David. Great King David. Naomi, who thought she was empty and cursed by God, who was bitter and angry at God and at the world at the beginning of this story, because of God's plan, was the great-great-grandmother of the man after God's own heart, the greatest king the nation of Israel ever had. Look how small her view was. God had this worked out all along. This was his plan from before the foundation of the world. God had all the details worked out. Think about it. If there hadn't been a famine, Elimelech and Naomi would never have left Israel for Moab. If they hadn't left for Moab, then Naomi's sons wouldn't have married Moabite women, including Ruth. If Elimelech and her sons hadn't died, they would have stayed in Moab and never become involved with Boaz in the story in any way. If Ruth hadn't stayed with Naomi, none of this would have worked out. If Boaz was married or a cruel man, he wouldn't have chosen to act as kinsman redeemer. Do you see how small the plans and schemes of Naomi were? Her view was incomplete, but God had all the details worked out from the beginning. And through the details that took place in this story, good and bad, God was working to bring his plan to completion. God was working through the details that Naomi couldn't even begin to think about to bring fulfillment to his plan. And the same is true for you. God is working through the details that you can't possibly even begin to think about to bring his plan for you to completion. See, we say that we trust God, even when we don't understand what's going on in our lives. But more often than not, we don't live like it. When things don't go our way or when our plans don't seem to work out, we usually get mad or get bitter at the world, at other people, at God. We get frustrated and we get angry. We huff, we groan, we complain. That's how we react. Now, we don't like it when a toddler does it. But usually, when things don't go our way, we react the same way a 3-year-old does. We may not hold our breath or stomp our feet, but we throw the adult temper tantrum. Bitterness, rage, frustration, negativity. Maybe we even feel like God is cursing us and nothing can go right. Just another thing on the list. More often than not, when things don't go our way, when we don't understand what's happening, when our plans get messed up, we react like Naomi. We react like Naomi because, like her, our view of things is tiny. Her view of what was going on in her life was about that big. And that's how we are too. We see what's wrong. We see our plan. We see how it got messed up. We see the present situation. But look at the story of the book of Ruth. The plan of God fulfilled in the book of Ruth does not even fit in the book of Ruth. It starts before the book of Ruth begins, and it continues into Samuel and Kings and well after that. The plan of God in the book of Ruth can't be contained by the book of Ruth. Nor could God's plan fit into Naomi's little brain. And again, the same is true for you. You are part of God's plan for the world. How do I know? Because you're here. And just like his plan for Naomi couldn't fit in her little mind, God's plan for you can't fit in your little brain space either. So what we learn from the book of Ruth is that God has a plan. That God's plan will be fulfilled. And what did Paul tell you last week about God's plan for you in your life? It's for your good and not to harm you. That it's to give you hope and a future, and it's to lead you to him. Because God knows that the ultimate purpose of our lives and the greatest good we could ever have is to be known by him and to know him. What's going on may not make sense. It may not look great in that moment. You may not get it. You may not be able to understand. You might not be able to see it. But God does have a plan for you. It is far bigger than you could possibly imagine. Because, like with the conclusion of the book of Ruth and those old television infomercials, but wait, there's more. Naomi's grandson, Ruth's son, Obed, is the grandfather of David. And the New Testament traces the ancestry of Jesus back through David. That means that good old, bitter, empty Naomi is included in God's plan to bring salvation to the world. When there was a famine, when Elimelech and her sons died, when she came back with Ruth, through all that, God was working his plan to bring Jesus to earth to save the world. Do you see how God's plan was infinitely bigger than Naomi could possibly even know? She was part of the plan to save the world and couldn't possibly appreciate what was going to happen through her and through her life. And for a third time, the same is true for you. What gigantic part of the plan of God are you part of but don't realize? You can't possibly know, just like Naomi couldn't know. Your little head nugget can't fit around it. What we can do is trust the one who does understand it all, even when we can't, because he sees the end from the beginning. So trust God. Trust him. As the women of Bethlehem point out to Naomi, even when she thought it was all lost, when she was bitter and God had left her without a redeemer, God had taken care of all that in his plan. He already knew. Through the plan of God for Naomi, he also has not left you without a redeemer. The plan of God for Naomi's life is part of the plan of God for your life. Jesus redeems us and saves us from our sins and brings us back to God if we believe. You see, our plans fail. They're incomplete. They are tiny. Our ways are messed up and tend to be wrong. But God works all things for the good of those who love him. He worked through the plans of honorable people like Boaz and through the dangerous schemes of people like Naomi, and even the evil plans, people all throughout history to bring you Jesus. And it's more than that. Because Ruth was not a Hebrew. So in a Hebrew mind, she shouldn't be part of the ancestry of the Messiah. But see, God had that worked out in his plan too. That famine happened. Naomi went to Moab. Her son married a Moabite woman. She brought the Moabite woman back to Israel to include that Moabite woman in the ancestry of Jesus to show that God's plan all along has been salvation for everyone, not just a select people. Anyone who believes can have salvation through Jesus. God worked all those details out in his plan to bring us, to bring you, Jesus. And he did this while you were his enemy. He did this while you mistreated him. He did this while you were unaware, while you couldn't even be aware because you weren't here yet. He did this because he loves you. He worked all these details that we couldn't possibly understand just because he can. Because it brings him glory. When we see the intricacy and the all-encompassing nature of the plan of God, the only sensible response is to praise him and realize how far beyond us he is. We should trust him and accept the fulfillment of his plan in our lives and believe in Jesus. And we should do our part in his plan, which is far greater than we could ever possibly know. I mean, do you think that when Naomi came back to Bethlehem bitter and said, "Don't call me pleasant, call me bitter," do you think that she knew thousands of years later people would be reading her story? I mean, you don't think anyone's going to be reading your story 1,000 years from now, right? Who knows? The plan of God is far bigger than you can even imagine, and you are part of it. So, when your plans fail, when things don't go your way, when your world seems to be falling apart, remember the story of Ruth and Naomi and rest in the assurance that God's plan is more than you can know. He is working it right now in the good and in the bad. His plan is to prosper you and give you hope and a future and bring you to know him. If you love him, he is working all things for your good. So trust him. The lesson from the book of Ruth is the overwhelming plan of God will be fulfilled. As God says in Isaiah 46, "Listen to me, you who have been carried by me from birth, from before you were born. Even when you're old and gray, I will be the same. I am he who will be there and sustain you. I have done it, and I will bear you. I will carry you, and I will save you." Remember this. Keep it in mind. Take it to heart, you rebels. I am God. There is no other. I'm God. There is no one like me. I declare the end from the beginning, and from ancient times, things which have not been done. I say, my plan will be established. I will do all that I please. What I have said, that I will bring about. I have planned it. I will certainly do it. Listen to me, you hard-headed, who are far from my righteousness. I will bring righteousness near. It is not far away. My salvation will not be delayed. I will grant salvation in Zion and my glory for Israel. Trust him.